Hello, Tonee Messiah.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, and delighted that you could join us today. Your exhibition is titled In the Practice of Sitting at Nicholas Thompson Gallery in Melbourne. And we'll talk about it very shortly. As usual, I want to start very quickly by encouraging the viewer of this conversation, if they can, to go to the gallery website to find the exhibition images, to look at those images, ideally at the same time as listening to our conversation, so that we get the best value out of referring to particular images and the things, Tonee, that you decide to share with us today. And I wanted to start, if I could, with a sense of the themes of the exhibition, because there are three perhaps major themes running through the exhibition and the works in it. What are those themes?
So the title of the show is In the Practice of Sitting, and kind of the genesis of the idea came from an exploration into the physical form and as how it moves in different spaces. So the previous show that I had last year was to do with sort of social dynamics in spaces. And then we were hit with COVID, and I was kind of forced to restrain my movements physically to a domestic space at home. So all of the ideas that I'd had about exploring bodily movements in space suddenly got pinched into this single location. And the show evolved basically from that experience. So the themes that came up were posture, place, and sensation. And those three were almost like, I guess, starting points to understand the body, what happens in terms of the posture, so the sitting, the bending, the laying of the body, the sensations that occur within the body in those forms, and also certain places in the domestic space that are incredibly familiar, but took on different form because of the nature of the restrictions involved.
So very much the range of works in the exhibition are all referential to your experience in that limited sense of space due to the COVID restrictions in those three different ways. But looking back a little more broadly, some of your works in the past have very much been about your relationship with space, your understanding of space and place, partly because of your own history of understanding space. As a child, you travelled a lot back and forth between Israel and Australia, and that sense of where you were was really important. But how has that generally manifest, that understanding of space and place in your works?
I think the dislocation of familiar spaces really makes someone quite aware of their surrounding, and it also kind of offers a sense that you really need to situate yourself with intention. Whereas if you are familiar with your environment, you're not as aware of yourself and the space around you. And when you're dislocated from that familiarity, you end up being hyper aware of it. So I think these multiple incidents of being dislocated, I suppose, just taught me how important it is to really be aware of how I fit into space, both socially, physically, all of the different dynamics that are involved in a child's kind of situating of themselves in the society they live in.
So that much bigger picture, in a sense, almost gets focused and condensed by the restrictions that the COVID situation has placed on you for this exhibition, for the works in this exhibition. Has that, I'm not sure if this is a good metaphor, but has that resulted in a sense in you creating works which are a little bit like painting a painting using a very restricted palette?
No, I don't entirely think that's how it manifested. I think what it was is more because I'd been engaging in this idea of the body in social spaces, and it was always about the relationship between how the dynamic of the space or the lived experience affects the way that the body feels and moves and traverses space. And then suddenly there was this very familiar, almost inert home, which didn't have any tensions from the outside world. So what ended up happening is that there was a much deeper burrowing sort of internally. The work, I guess, manifested in a much more taut sensation or taut sense of its aesthetics, where there wasn't this spreading out into the edges of the work. It seemed to be more clustered, almost like belly button forms, where there's this me in this place in this time,
Yes.
which that's how I understood the transition of my aesthetics for this show.
Would an example of that slightly condensed or clustered feel be a work like, for example, and let's go to one or two of the works now, to Relapse, which seems to have some slightly repetitive forms in it. And is that one of the ones related perhaps to posture? You mentioned that was one of the three themes that you were exploring.
Yes, absolutely. So Relapse was one of the first works that I made, and it was an exploration of sitting and sitting in a single location for a long period of time. And it was, I suppose it was almost like a reading of the repositioning of your body in a sitting position. So that sensation where you're sort of losing your posture and then having to resituate yourself again. And that process of repetition became almost this motif where you're in your spot, and then throughout time you start to kind of lose your sense of structure, and then you have to realign yourself.
So for the viewer, perhaps standing in front of that work or some of the other works, how do you hope that sense of connection between their imagination and your experience of that physical posture change and the feeling of it and the representation of it in the work, how do you hope that connection gets made?
This is always a question that I suppose I find I want to avoid answering in some instances, and only because the nature of the work that I do doesn't sit within predictable languages. So I kind of rely on the fact that the viewer comes into the work with a very nuanced relationship to the surface. I don't necessarily want the viewer to understand it in terms of my experience, but rather have something that tantalizes them to be engaged in the surface. And if that sense of the things that inspired the work does infiltrate their experience, that's sort of a bonus.
So it's almost as though the work is an intuitive experience for them rather than a descriptive or a prescriptive experience.
Yes, that's a really wonderful way to describe it. Yeah. They're images of my experience, and they don't necessarily have to be shared experiences with the viewer, but rather just notations of my place, my time, my experience, and hopefully with an invitational and generous doorway for a viewer to be engaged.
Sometimes the hints do seem a little stronger than others. Another work, Synthesized Waterfall, could perhaps be you in the shower for a very long time. Would that be far off the mark, thinking of you at home?
Yes, no, that's spot on. Yeah, and certainly I think in the titling of the work sometimes I do offer a closer connection to what the work might be about, and certainly within that work, it is exactly that. It's about the physical sensation of water falling on you and the sort of daydreamy mindfulness that comes as a result.
You mentioned titles, and as people look through the exhibition on the gallery website, and just a reminder, please, for the viewer to do that, and of course the viewer can pause and stop our conversation so they can find the right images at the right time. But you mentioned titles, and your titles seem very careful. They seem very carefully thought through. How important are the titles in terms of providing some degree of clue or indication or pointer to the viewer as to how they might start relating to the work?
They're probably the closest way that I can offer a bridge between my language and a viewer's language. I think in the nature of abstract image making, and especially something that is, I suppose, evolving, where I don't have this very specific style that can be learnt over time, I think the titles are the easiest way for a viewer to kind of just get a little kind of scratch into the surface to come in. So the titles are incredibly considered. They also try not to, they're using language in the same way that I'm using visual language abstractly. So the titles are designed to offer a small clue, but not to be descriptive, like you said.
So with a work like, for example, all content, no form, where does one go from there? And can you talk to that work just a little?
Yeah, so all content, no form was one of the ones that sat under the sensations theme. And it was inspired by the reading of my mind and body throughout a kind of long session at a table working. And the surge of information that seems to come into the mind and how the body almost becomes forgotten. There is no form to yourself anymore. You're just a processor. So the imagery that resulted was this almost kind of electric explosion of stuff. It didn't have any form. It was just pure sensation kind of pushing out.
You mentioned the three themes, the three broad themes of the exhibition. And I wonder whether you might like to nominate a work or even 2 or 3 works that might help people who come to the exhibition or who look at the exhibition online find their way into those 3 senses of thematic difference. How can they do that with particular works?
Mm-hmm. Within the posture theme, I isolated, there's 6 works in total that sit under the posture bracket. 3 of them were derived from understandings of the sitting posture, and 3 from the bending. And within the bending, there's some that are obviously associated, especially through titling, but there's some that deal with the muscular tensions that occur in the body during a posture of bending. There's one called Surge Mass, which I think is probably the most obscure of the 3 in terms of relating it to the body moving that way, but it was designed to speak to the tensions and the weights of the body as it moves into its posture. So as the body is bending forward or backwards, the awareness of weight and the awareness of tension within the muscles. So I think as you come into the show, through the titling, you can probably guess the sitting, and possibly some of the bending. That one is probably the one that sits a little bit left of field. So hopefully that's a clue in.
Well, thank you for the clues. In terms of the way in which these and your past works have developed this intuitive process of sharing or representing areas of experience that you've developed, how has that developed in terms of your painting practice? How has it come to deliver the type of work which can be seen in this exhibition?
Intuition plays a very, very important role in my work. It has always run as the informant for my work. I did a master's degree in 2017 that was based on an analysis of intuition in the painting process. And it was about understanding how intuition is kind of assisted or impeded through the act of painting. And a lot of the impeding that I noticed was to do with the materials of paint, and that the dazzling sensation of the stuff of painting can sometimes misalign you from reading intuitive things that come into your mind. So I think intuition definitely plays a crucial role still in my work, especially through abstract language making. You're always, and I think I've spoken about this before, about this kind of like, you're aware of everything that sits behind you and your knowledge that you've got, that you're contained. And the intuition is what gives you kind of an ability to jump into the unknown, or into that next iteration of language. It's almost like developing a new dialect in the known language that you've already got. And you're constantly kind of reaching for something new within that intuitive process.
As you leap into that unknown, as you develop that new dialect, as you say, often it's sometimes based on a language that already exists. And is it also important to have, as part of that process, influences or foundations or even allies who have created or explored some of these areas previously? And who have your influences or companions in that exploration been?
I used to kind of bury quite deeply into my visual inspirations. I used to really gobble up the artists that I loved and kind of be across their entire collection of work. And I found in the last 3 or 4 years, I resist that deep dive into inspiration. I kind of very gently want to almost kind of pick bits and pieces from different images that I see so that I can collect them in my own way. It can be very difficult to resist the visual inspirations that you engage in your painting practice, because they're so visually stimulating and they're so enjoyable to you that you want to pick them and place them in your own work. But because I'm trying to engage with intuitive responses, I have to be very careful about how much of that comes in. So what I tend to do as a tactic is to see images and have little moments within a painting that I really love or that I'm interested in that does something unpredictable or kind of resists a common reading of visual language. And I'll sort of just store that in the back. And if it finds its way out in the work, wonderful, but I have to be very unintentional about how that happens.
It's fascinating to hear the explanation of your thinking and the process behind the creation of the work. But in terms of explanation and thinking, how important is the academic side of not only your art practice, but particularly your teaching, because teaching is a big part of your life. How important is the process of teaching and explaining your perceptions to your students?
It's been surprisingly very, very influential in the way that I work. And I would never have expected it to have such a strong effect. I think because I guess the form that I choose to teach is about finding the common ground or the middle ground between someone's perceptions and my own, and adjusting myself and the way that I communicate or the way that I explain something verbally so that I can get onto a student's level. It's almost a muscle in the brain that you exercise, where you're shifting your communication style in order to really be clear and articulate about what you want to say, and also to be sure that you're understanding someone else's articulation correctly. So I think that act of having to adjust yourself constantly to other people's communication styles, that comes into your painting practice, because you're asking yourself, how is this image working? How is it being read? Is it possible that it could be read completely differently to what I'm used to seeing?
Let's go back to the exhibition now and one or two specific images, and I wonder if perhaps you can just explore them or share a little of them for the viewer who might be looking at them. If I just nominate one or two. One with the potentially ambiguous title of Mould. Let's start there. Speak to Mould just a little, if you would.
Sure. Mould is under the sitting bracket of posture, and it was the sheer mass of the body putting itself into a chair, and it was moulding the body into the chair that's in it. It was kind of understanding the physical structure that holds your weight and how your body fashions itself into that mould. So that's where the title came from. The aesthetic of the work has these kind of blobs or lumps that all sit almost collaged together. And it's designed to have the association with weight and with matter that is all sort of sandwiching together.
Thank you. Shrouded.
Shrouded belongs in the, in that one kind of, Shrouded was one of the later works that I finished. It bounced between a few different iterations. In the end, it was to do with being actually sitting on a couch, and it's to do with place. And it's the way that the couch lets you almost melt into it, and you become very disconnected from your mind and your body. It's a place, I guess, of deep relaxation where everything can be unhooked. And the idea of shrouding is that the couch envelops you in this cloth or in this protective film that lets you just unhook or unplug.
It's fascinating. Oh, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to hear the way in which you can, with such intensity of experience, even though the experience itself might have been quite an ordinary one, sitting down in a couch, thinking, or watching TV or whatever it is that you might happen to do. It's really fascinating to hear how you can connect that to the intuitive nature of the painted work, and I'm intrigued to hear that. And I'd like to finish up with a final work which has the most deliberate of titles, given all of what we've been talking about in terms of what you want to achieve with the titles and the works. Intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Into intent.
Intent is a work on paper, so it's watercolour and gouache on paper, and it's built up with, I guess, that work has the most interrelated things and marks that all kind of sit like a web. Intent was thinking about when you leave the safety of your home, and during this time where being outdoors meant you had to be hyper aware of your movements and of your body's borders. And intent was about how you're moving in the public spaces. So once you've left this beautiful, predictable, safe space that is 99% of your day, the kind of angst that starts to happen in having to be very intentional about your movements, where at home you can sort of just let yourself move with the space and let yourself move freely. It was almost like the clicking into your hyper-awareness and vigilance.
Well, that sense of hyper-awareness is something I think we can now understand much more fully by virtue of the way in which you've manifested that hyper-awareness in your works. So it's been fascinating to hear about the exhibition. And Tonee Messiah, thanks for sharing your exhibition with us.
Thanks so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure.